Hi, welcome to my channel, or welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to give my thoughts about this book called A Journal of the Plague Year by Daniel Defoe. This book is very interesting to read in the light of COVID and thinking about the difference in the way they have dealt with their plague and the way we dealt with our plague. This account was written in 1665 when Daniel Defoe was only 5, so it can actually be a pure work of nonfiction, but historians basically agree that Defoe basically says exactly what the plague would be like, maybe with a few embellishments. You notice when you read this that the response to the infection is very aggressive. There's a lot of shutting up of houses. We had more of a voluntary in many countries, compulsory self-isolation system rather than the actual shutting up of houses, whereas China had this more aggressive stance. The narrator is a wealthy tradesman, and his brother advises him to leave London. The narrator thinks what God would want him to do. So this is a little bit like Robinson Crusoe, where there's a lot of reflection on what God would want and mention of providence and so forth. There's a large section recounting how con artists and various superstitions loomed large in London at this time. People basically tried to make money out of cures that didn't cure the infection, and you can just imagine London at its worst. But of course people were just trying to make it by themselves and live. The narrator talks about the way the doctors and nurses risked their lives to help the infected, much like we were so thankful during the pandemic that medical staff helped us. So they shut up the houses when they knew infections were in them, and watchmen were employed to prevent people escaping, which was seen as cruel to those who weren't actually infected. Those who just lived with people who were infected, that is. I found there were interesting details of occupations in this work, and there were statistics about how many people had died and so forth, which were a little dull, but made the points the author was trying to make. In this work, there are lots of little stories about particular people and types of people, such as nurses who evidently sometimes stole from the people they were looking after during the plague. We hear about a piper who seemed to be dead, so he was picked up by burial people and almost buried alive by mistake. Little tales like this. We learned that London was really not prepared for this plague. Businesses that relied on trade particularly had difficult times because boats from other countries daren't come up the Thames, the major river in London. But we learned that a lot of people were needed to clear away all the bodies. So much like in COVID, the infection ceased much activity in the town, and people went out of business and struggled. Evidently, few houses were without a cat in London. And we learned that all the cats and dogs in London were immediately put to death, which also seems very harsh, upon the outbreak of the infection. So you just feel like at this time the Londoners were treating the plague extremely seriously. And the wealthy Londoners moved out to the provinces where it was safer with the fresh air and so forth. Much like I think you would see during COVID. Defoe writes that people started having delusions once they were infected, and speculates about malice in those who were infected, like they wanted other people to have it because they'd had it. And also tells us some stories about individuals and their malicious spreading of the infection. Throughout this work, the infection is called the distemper, and when the infection comes upon people, it's called a visitation. It almost seems like it's regarded as a supernatural event. And we learn of silly ideas that various physicians had to cure the bug. We also learn that other countries such as France wouldn't accept any goods from England because of the plague. This work gets religious towards the close of the book, with Defoe talking about their deliverance from the infection. I quite liked this book. I think it's very interesting to read in the light of COVID, and makes you wonder, could more steps have been taken so that COVID just ceased to exist? Certainly the West opened up quite early, whereas China was very keen on eradicating the infection. I would give it 2 stars out of 5 because it isn't incredibly well written or anything like that, but I still think it's a good read. So please give me your thoughts about COVID or this work if you've read it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.